Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon. I'm Dan Rundy. I'm the Senior Vice President here at CSIS, and I also hold the Schreier Chair in Global Analysis. I'm very grateful that you would all join us for this conversation on preventing catastrophe in Afghanistan. I want to welcome our hundreds of online viewers who are live streaming this event from their homes for this very important conversation on mitigating the consequences of an accelerated withdrawal in Afghanistan and what are some possible next steps. On April 14th, President Biden announced a complete U.S. withdrawal by September 11th, 2021. As the U.S. withdrawal develops, the economic, political, and human rights future of Afghanistan remains uncertain. These issues in Afghanistan also play into U.S. interests in the surrounding region, and including human rights, development, political, and economic stability. A current and future challenge will be in determining what role the United States can and should play in Afghanistan following a military withdrawal, and what pathways remain for resolution of the regional conflict. I frankly wished it wasn't this way. I would like to have seen us keep troops in Afghanistan. This is Dan's editorial comment on this, but I think the decision has been made, and I think that that horse has left the barn, if you will. We've done a series of things here at CSIS. We have a number of affiliates who've made some very thoughtful contributions. Several of them are panelists. We have some forthcoming work coming out as well on this. We thought it was important to do a public event on this topic at this time. I'm very grateful that Ambassador Adela Raz is with us. We also, I believe, have Congressman Michael Waltz, as well as my very good friends, esteemed panelists, and who are also CSIS experts, Ambassador Tony Wayne, Ambassador Rick Olson, and my very good friend Annie Forsheimer, all CSIS affiliates and experts. So I'm so grateful for all of them joining us today. Ambassador Raz is the current Afghan permanent representative to the United Nations, and I hope will be joining us in Washington next month as the Afghan ambassador to the United States. Congressman Michael Waltz represents Florida's 6th District, and if the technology works, we hope to have him either in person or by phone, and serves on the House Armed Services Committee and is the vice chair of the 4-Country Caucus. And I've mentioned Ambassador Wayne, who had a distinguished career at the State Department, served as Deputy Ambassador to Afghanistan, who was the quarterback for coordinating for all development and economic affairs. Ambassador Olson was the former special representative of Afghanistan, and he was also ambassador to Pakistan. And then Annie Forsheimer, who also was at the State Department, was Deputy Chief of Mission in Kabul, as well as acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Afghanistan. So a lot of expertise here. I want to quickly remind our online viewers that this is an interactive online event, and I invite you all to participate through questions for our panel of CSIS experts on preventing catastrophe in Afghanistan. To submit your questions, please go to our webpage at csis.org and click on Ask Live Questions Here button. I will then select a few of those questions as a moderator for our panelists to answer. Time for action in Afghanistan is running out, which is why we must explore all opportunities before withdrawal is finalized, which is why we are all here today. So let's jump right into our conversation. I believe Congressman Waltz will make some remarks.
I am so sorry. I'm going to have to keep this very brief. We just got called to go vote. But I think to be candid, that we are, I fear, making a strategic mistake with a full withdrawal from Afghanistan. I've long supported keeping a small training capacity to continue to work with and train our Afghan national security partners, and a counterterrorism capacity. With half the world's terrorist organizations, unfortunately, that still exist in the Afghan-Pakistani border region, I believe we risk repeating the mistake that the Obama administration made in its precipitous withdrawal from Iraq. We know how that horror movie played out with the rise of ISIS, attacks across Western Europe, and inspired attacks across the United States. But I think there's a broader great power aspect to this as well, and that Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan that we are on the verge of shutting down in the next few weeks is the only base in the world that physically borders China, is on the southern flank of Russia and the eastern flank of Iran. So to give that base up as well, to me, makes very little sense. And then finally, we just have the humanitarian aspect of this. I have seen and witnessed, sadly, gross abuses on women and ethnic minorities. I have seen a girls' school machine gunned with the girls still in it, women attacked for going to work, Afghan female leaders, as brave and amazing as they are, deliberately targeted. And now we're seeing our local Afghan allies, not just interpreters, civil society leaders, journalists, politicians, and others who have truly stood with us shoulder to shoulder in this global war on extremism that are now being hunted down as we speak. This administration has a moral imperative to evacuate and get those people out. And we can do the processing and the appropriate vetting in a third country, in Guam, UAE, Qatar. The Pentagon has said they're ready to do it. They are literally waiting on the green light from the White House, and I cannot get a sufficient explanation for why that's going to happen or why that hasn't happened. And then finally, I'll just remind everyone that our Afghan army and police brothers and sisters will continue, I think, not just to fight for their security, but the world's security. The intelligence community is clear that Al-Qaeda can and intends to come roaring back in the wake of Taliban advances. And we have to continue to support them financially with the Afghan Security Forces Fund within the Congress, and Congress's role going forward will be critical. That said, I don't know what type of oversight capability we are still going to have. And that gives me real pause. South Vietnam didn't fall necessarily when the United States withdrew its advisors. It fell when the Congress really got fed up and cut off the funding. And then the thing that makes me most concerned is the lack of a real plan for ongoing counterterrorism. I have yet to see any country in the region raise its hand to allow us basing and access and overflight to continue to pressure Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I certainly don't expect it from Pakistan, China, Russia, or Iran. And I certainly don't expect it from any of the stands. So I have grave doubts about this notion of over the horizon counterterrorism. That is completely, I think it's a bit of a fantasy, frankly. So I don't know how to be more blunt than that. Daniel, but just to close, as much as I think this is incredibly dangerous and irresponsible policy for this just total, complete, and rushed withdrawal, that moral imperative to help those that stood with us absolutely remains. I think this administration will have blood on its hands if it doesn't take action soon. And when that last U.S. soldier goes wheels up, if we haven't evacuated those folks, they really will have a death sentence. And that is heartbreaking to me, who has very personal and real experiences with not only interpreters that we successfully got out. One is on the cover of my book and is thriving in Texas today with his family, but I've also lost those that were waiting in line, that were executed for standing with America. So thank you. I appreciate you covering this, and thanks so much for having me. It's a real honor.
Thank you, Congressman. It's an honor. Thanks for your service. Good. Ambassador Raz, thanks for being here. It was really important to me that we had an Afghan voice. Thank you for providing your perspective and voice. I welcome your comments, Ambassador Raz.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a pleasure to join you today for this very critical discussion on the future of my country, Afghanistan. I look forward to listening to the insight of the distinguished panelists and a thoughtful discussion. I also would like to express my gratitude to Congressman Michael Waltz for his opening remarks and very strong support to Afghanistan. We have arrived at an inflection point in Afghanistan history. As international troops withdraw, especially the US, the security situation is very complex, and heinous attacks against civilian targets have increased. The Afghan people and our international allies have a very important road ahead. There is also a big question if we will get the opportunity to live in peace for the first time in 40 years. Afghanistan's destiny will be determined by the right decisions we all make in the coming months. Let me be clear, further insecurity and chaos are not the foregone certain conclusions, despite the rhetoric promoted by some. However, it is a real risk and a likely outcome unless further action is taken. Because what I hear a lot of times in recent days, I feel our allies and friends have already decided that the future of Afghanistan will be complex and let's prepare for a worst case scenario. And here I'm coming from Afghanistan, and I'm telling you very clearly that it will be a complex and difficult time, but it will be not a foregone gains we have made in the last 20 years. It's extremely important that we must make sure that our narrative, the narrative we are sharing here in the US and outside of the US with all allies and friends, and the narratives that's echoed in Afghanistan to Afghan people, we promote certainty and we promote our commitment. Because in 20 years, we stood shoulder to shoulder together. And as Congressman said very clearly, it was the Afghan forces, and it is the Afghan forces today that are fighting on the forefront of a global terrorism. And it's a serious threat, and it is a real threat. As written by former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates in a guest essay in the New York Times last week, the US cannot completely abandon Afghanistan. It would be a disservice to our troops, to our Afghan partners, and most importantly, it would not be in the US national interest. And I think it's very clear. The Afghan security forces are on the front line of a global war on terrorism. They have fought bravely for many, many years against our common enemy, and they will continue the brave battle after international troops withdrawal, but they need the support. Our security forces are capable of carrying out the fighting themselves. The figures we have already in front of us, and especially our US colleague knows that very clearly, that the operations in the ground are run by Afghan security forces. They have performed the main battle-related activities for years. However, continuous support for our logistical and maintenance activities plus capacity is needed. We must make sure that in the forefront of this fight is supported, and it is the logistical support that we need. Our security forces will also continue to need the financial support. COVID-19 has contributed to a budgetary shortfall when more resources are required to support the transition. In many countries, especially developed countries, COVID-19 was a curse that arrived and it hurt the economies drastically. And for a country like Afghanistan that we're still in the battlefield, it truly hurt the economy, and the continuous support to our security forces will be essential. One of the most effective tools for peace is the continued implementation of the UN sanctions regime against the Taliban. Meaning while we are fighting in the forefront, we still need to open the door for negotiations. This is extremely important. We have to make sure that Taliban agrees and Taliban realizes that their ability and their wish and their desire and their assumption that they think they might be able to take control of certain cities will be only a despair and truly a wish and desire that will never come to the reality. And it's also essential that we clearly communicate that no actor in the international community will support the return of the Islamic Emirates, the name of the Taliban government, The Taliban must know that in the unlikely scenario in which they assume they can take over the government by force, they will be left isolated without access to international financial resources or support. Another key ingredient to the success of the peace process is vocal support for an inclusive process and the government's defined end state. President Ghani and Dr. Abdullah are working through the High Council for Peace and Reconciliation to develop and mobilize a comprehensive and inclusive peace plan supported by all stakeholders and representatives from all segments of the Afghan society. We also further stress that the process must be inclusive and include the voice of all Afghans, especially women, minorities, and youth. The role of civil society is vital in this regard and has helped to facilitate broad-based discussion on peace. However, the rise in targeted killings and attacks directly threatening the inclusive nature of the process and aim to silence important voices. We must stand united in our condemnation of such actions. We also continue to look to the United Nations for support throughout the peace process. We believe that strengthening UNAMA would assist our efforts to achieve an inclusive, lasting, and effective peace. Hence, we are encouraging the Security Council to consider ways to strengthen and expand UNAMA's mandate in the upcoming renewal in the month of September. Finally, I would like to conclude that my hope and my determination for the future is very bright. I do acknowledge and I do understand the upcoming months are very difficult months, but here we have a joint journey together. Here we have a joint objective together. Here we have a fight that we have to prove that tyranny and destruction will never, never win. It's the brightness and it's our shared values that we established and we gained and we strengthened it in the last 20 years. This is the type of Afghanistan that will prevail. This is the type of Afghanistan that will last long. This is the type of Afghanistan that every Afghan wishes to see. And that's the fight we have continued and we will fight. And you have an ally, and Congressman said it really, really well. I think there is a common interest. It's beyond looking very isolated to in the case of Afghanistan and saying this is a fight that it must end, and which we agree, this is a fight that it must end. But how do we end? It's extremely important. How do we leave a precedent to other terrorist groups globally? How would they look to the type of political settlement we agreed to? I think I'm going to conclude with one strong message that we all need to have. And I think it inspired me by the title of the discussion today, which it says, Preventing Catastrophe in Afghanistan. I know we all are preparing or thinking of a worst case scenario, but I must tell you the catastrophe is not as magnified in Afghanistan as much as it is outside of Afghanistan. And if we look into it as a catastrophe, I think we right away question the type of investment we have made in the last 20 years and its effectiveness. So there is no catastrophe. I think it's a very difficult testing period for us, where it truly will test our solidarity, our message of unity, and more than anything, how do we respond to tyranny, to terrorism, and to destruction? And how do we manage the terrorist groups globally that look to Taliban and they look up to them as their godfathers? And there is a capability in Afghanistan, there is ability in our Afghan National and Defense Security Forces. American colleagues know that. And where we are lacking, it's the logistical and the financial support. And we hope to have that for a solid few years, where we would be able to maintain the fight and prove to Taliban they will never ever win by force. They must come to the negotiating table and they must agree to the new Afghanistan, the Afghanistan that stands on the principles of democracy, women's rights, and human rights. I'm going to stop here, my dear colleagues, and I will be more than happy to answer any question, but I look forward to hear your reflections.
Thank you, Ambassador Raz. We look forward to having you in Washington in the near future, and thank you for your public service. Thank you for this important message you've just delivered. I want to now turn to my friends and colleagues on the panel. Let me, all three of these folks have been moral beacons for me at CSIS over the last 5 years on issues related to Afghanistan. They really know a lot about the country and our involvement in Afghanistan. And we've done a series of things over the last couple of months to collectively, the folks on this panel and myself. So let me ask a question to all three of you: is what must the United States absolutely continue to do in Afghanistan, and what steps does the United States need to take? That's a question for all three of you. Let me start with Ambassador Olson.
Thanks, Dan, and thank you very much for including me in this distinguished panel today. Look, I think there are a couple things that the United States needs to do. First of all, it needs to continue and enhance, where possible, economic support, development support for the government of Afghanistan, both on a bilateral basis and especially through the World Bank, through the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund, which in many ways actually funds the government on a day-to-day basis. So that's critically important. Obviously, as was already alluded to, I think Congressman Waltz referred to it, the US needs to continue to support robustly the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. We need to figure out ways to keep the Train, Advise, and Assist mission going remotely. And most importantly, we need to find a way to allow contracting to continue. That's something that could really, that's something that's causing a great deal of nervousness in Kabul right now, because as we're departing, the contracts are being wound down, they need to be replaced, and they need to be replaced quickly. The final point I would make is perhaps a bit more controversial, and we can come back to this. But I think the United States has invested a lot in the Afghan peace process, and it has found itself being in the position of being both a mediator and a party to the conflict. And I think the contradictions of that position have now reached their fruition. And I think it's time for the United States to frankly get out of the mediation business. I think it makes sense for us to hand the reins over to the United Nations and pivot towards being a robust supporter of the Republic. Over.
Thank you. Annie Forsheimer, what must the United States do? You wrote a very thoughtful piece. I'd welcome your thoughts, Annie.
Thank you so much. I have to agree wholeheartedly with what Ambassador Olson, Congressman Waltz, and Ambassador Raz spoke about. Most important, in a way, is the narrative and how we approach it, that our commitment to Afghanistan should be foremost, and the way that we talk about our future there should be the first and the last talking point of any discussion. The support to these security forces is essential, as Ambassador Raz and others have pointed out. They are the ones doing the fighting. They are the right ones to do the fighting. But there are a lot of details, and Congress has to stay on top of the administration. In a number of hearings, the administration spoke about its commitment, but then when you look at the details, as Ambassador Olson mentioned, the contracting, or what kind of intelligence support for defensive purposes can continue, there it's far less clear, and it's very evident that this decision was made without the right planning ahead of time. I think there must continue to be a lot of pressure on the Taliban to negotiate the continuation of UN sanctions. Frankly, they could be added to, because the Taliban continues to act in ways that destabilize the country, which is the premise of the sanctions. And finally, as I mentioned in my written piece, let's think about all our issues, all our interests as a country. We have interests in stability in that region. We have interests in preventing atrocities. We have interests in preventing the flow of refugees, which we can show the effect it had politically on Europe after Syria. We have interests in trying to not do harm. And it's unconscionable that our decision is going to fly in the face of these other US national interests.
Ambassador Wayne.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thanks for having me, and thanks to all of my colleagues. I agree with all the points that the representative, the ambassador, and my colleagues have made. So let me just add a couple of things. There are sort of two levels of messaging that are really important right now. One is the United States and its allies sending clear messages to Afghans that we're going to be with you in the short term and in the long run. Now, there were some good messages that came out of the NATO summit in that connection. The second level is actually doing the things on the ground that were just being discussed. And that includes getting that funding and that assistance going. It also includes protecting the US Embassy and the other embassies there. If you're going to have an international presence in Kabul, you've got to show that that presence will be protected and be able to demonstrate that. And then, as the representative mentioned, we're also thinking through, what do you do for looking in the long run at the terrorist groups that are still there? The UN just issued a report saying the Taliban is still working closely with Al-Qaeda. And we know from the number of the sad attacks that have gone on against children and women that the Islamic State is very active in Afghanistan. So we have to work on that. So there are these two clusters of issues that have to go on at the same time. First, I think we could sum up to say that as our troops leave, we're staying engaged in other ways. And secondly, we need to work through all the specifics of making that a reality. And right now, there are a lot of people working hard on this, but it's not clear how this is going to work. And then we do need to think through, and there's wide support for this around the world, how we're going to support the continued respect for human rights, including women and others, as this process goes forward. As Ambassador Olson mentioned, this diplomacy to get back to serious negotiations is really important. But we have to have the ability and the morale on the part of the Afghans that they can better hold out in the short term so we can get back to that diplomacy. It seems pretty clear from the messages coming from the Taliban that they are hoping to increase pressure and to build momentum for them to dominate the scene one way or the other. And so that does mean, as Ambassador Ross was saying, that we need to give that support to the Afghans so they will demonstrate that no, Taliban, you have to negotiate. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you. Annie, what role does Congress have in all of this?
Congress has the power to hold the administration to their promises, to hold hearings as they have done recently, and to really ask for and demand. Even it's incredible that the NDAA from last year required a report on the consequences of a withdrawal, and that report was not in Congress's hand when the withdrawal announcement was made. They should be making sure that the money going to the ANDSF, which has been approved in previous years and looks on track to be approved again, but that it's going to be meaningful. Congress also should look at the diplomatic efforts that are so important, because the only way out of this is a meaningful negotiation. They should be supporting the continuation of sanctions, which is an executive branch function, but Congress has the power to impose sanctions itself. So they could be active in that respect. And finally, I think they should be part of that overall narrative, talking about all the interests that we have as a country. I mean, the Atrocity Prevention Act was 2018. The Global Fragility Act is 2019. We have expressed through Congress this desire of the United States to prevent violence. So that part of the congressional intention needs a little bit more airtime as we look at what is, unfortunately, although I hold the same hopes as Ambassador Raz, somewhat predictably a situation that could lead to chaos, to violence against women and children and minorities, and to refugees.
Thank you. Ambassador Olson, you have a forthcoming paper about the role of our allies and other regional actors Could you talk a little bit about some of your thoughts about the role of folks in the neighborhood?
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. Thank you. So when we look at the Afghan War, which for us it's been 20 years, for Afghans it's been more like 40 plus years, to my mind, it has three dimensions. There's the conflict amongst Afghans themselves. There's interventions by regional states, and there's the conflict at the international level. Well, the international level, at least the military aspects, are coming to an end, for better or for worse, with the U.S. decision of April 14th. Now the role of the international community, as we've discussed, is to continue to provide assistance, which is important both for keeping the government going, but also for future leverage with the Taliban in negotiations. And the intra-Afghan negotiations are proceeding, but they haven't made much progress. The Taliban has refused to engage on substance. And it's hard to see how they are going to make progress in the near term, I'm sorry to say. I think once the troops withdraw, the Taliban is likely to test the government. And so I think we're going to be in for a difficult period as the Taliban attempts to assert itself even more strongly militarily. But what hasn't really been completely explored is the regional dimension to the conflict, at least in terms of a peace process. Most of the region would probably actually agree that is to say, Afghanistan's neighbors would agree that they maybe are prepared to see the Taliban come back in some increased role in Afghanistan, but they don't want to see an Islamic emirate. They don't want to see what they saw in the 1990s. They don't want to see civil war. They don't want to see refugee flows or narcotics flowing out of Afghanistan. And most of all, they don't want to see proxy warfare within Afghanistan, into which they get sucked and in which there may be attacks out of Afghanistan into their territory. So it seems that what needs to happen is this tacit consensus needs to be hardened and made operational so that the region can actually put some pressure on the Taliban to come to the table and negotiate seriously. There's no modality right now, but the UN has appointed a special envoy, Ambassador Jean Arnaud, and he's very focused on regional issues. I note that in the most recent talks in Doha, the UNAMA chief, Ambassador Lyons, has been present. That's a positive development. But all of this is against a backdrop where the region, although it may believe that it prefers in Afghanistan at peace with itself and at peace with its neighbors, everybody has a plan B. And the plan B usually involves asking the intelligence agencies to make an alliance with a local Afghan faction to defend the narrow equities that we perceive. I would unfortunately perhaps include my own country in this regard, because the United States, at least according to the New York Times, is exploring, the CIA is exploring resuming its old relationship with the Panshiris. I think that would be a mistake if everybody does it. And so time is short. We need to launch a regional peace track and get the region to actually focus on what they can do to make that their vision a reality.
Great. Ambassador Wayne, we're going to be publishing a paper on what are we had a number of partners in Afghanistan we've worked and collaborated with over the last 20 years, including translators and others, both in the diplomatic side, the development side, the military side, the intelligence side. Could you talk about what responsibilities we have with those folks and what should we be doing?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dan. I think we have several levels of responsibility toward Afghans. Those who have worked for us, for the military, for the U.S. Embassy, for the U.S. Agency for International Development, are quite likely going to be subject to retribution by the Taliban. We know that a number of the ones who worked for the military already have been killed, and there are many threats. But I also know personally that a number of people that worked for the embassy have also received threats. We have a program called the Special Immigrant Visa Program to help bring people who have those threats to the United States. The ambition of the program is very generous. The performance of the program is flawed. It was flawed in Iraq, and it's flawed right now. There are over 12,000, there are 10 to 12,000 people at least who've applied and are waiting to try and get through that process. There are a number of bottlenecks in the process. It's very complicated and it takes a long time. And I think we can all foresee certain circumstances where you're not going to have time. So very fortunately, to pick up on Annie's theme, there are a number of Congress people who are looking at this and trying to introduce legislation that would help deal with some of the bottlenecks. The administration has put a lot of additional resources into trying to speed up the process within the current guidelines and to make that work faster. This is all very good, but it may be that we're in a situation where we just have to move outside of this program to help take care of people. And then beyond those who work directly for us, let's think about the people who actually believed in what we said when we were there. They're already being assassinated, whether they're human rights leaders, civil society leaders, women's rights leaders and groups. A lot of them are under threat. They feel threatened because a number of their colleagues have been killed. They don't fall into the categories under this SIV program. So we have many other Afghans and then their families who could be in great danger depending on the direction of things that head. So I would say in the short term, we really do need to focus on getting these resources to the Afghan security forces, to the Afghan government, to showing that the international community does care and is committed right now, but also for several years in the future. But we need to look at perfecting these other processes that can help take care of people. It's important to remember there are already about almost 5 million Afghans displaced within their country and over 2 million, 2.5 million outside of the country in refugee status. So there are many Afghans who have suffered from this 40-year war that Rick talked about. And there are certain scenarios where there could be more. We need to think through those scenarios while working to strengthen those who are willing and able and want to fight to defend a representative government in Kabul. And that also means that part of our peace diplomacy is urging the elites in Kabul to get their act together and act in unity also as we move forward, especially through these key months that are coming up. Over.
Thanks, Ambassador. Ambassador Raz, I see that you're still with us. I don't know if you wanted to comment. I mean, we've been having a conversation about your country. I'd welcome if you had any reflections on what my colleague panelists have been saying. I'd welcome you to just reflect a little bit on what you've heard here.
Sure, I think I agree with some of the proposals that colleagues share, and of course I'm definitely not in a position to be able to discuss how the US administration needs to take the next steps forward. But I think Congress here will be playing an important role. I think a complete narrative or a comprehensive narrative is really important to be shared. I think we do need to look into the situation in Afghanistan out of complete isolation, in a way, thinking that it's a fight between local militias and the government of Afghanistan or the Republic. I think it's beyond that. We have much data and information, and I think US administration has the most accurate information in the ground compared to any other countries in terms of, because of your footprint, that it's very complex, where the geopolitics play a role. There is a very strong linkages and very accurate and linkages between Taliban and the Al-Qaeda. So I think this narrative needs to be addressed or adjusted here in the US, that your engagement in Afghanistan for the last 20 years was a war that you had to settle in between local militias and the Afghan people, and you couldn't solve it, and here you are, and the business ended. I think it's more complex. You have made tremendous progress. Together we have made tremendous progress. It's a society that today believes in the principles of democracy, human rights, and that's the core values as the great country that you have brought with yourself to every region you have stepped in. And here we have arrived. We have truly arrived to a very testing period, and the geopolitics, and I think especially in our part of the region, is not moving in the right direction. Unfortunately, I think we all know, we have the reports, we have the intelligence, we have the right predictions, and we are in the center of it. And we will not be irrelevant to it. I think we will be a very relevant country to that type of change in the geopolitics. So. And I think there is also, if we look from a story of catastrophe, I think if we look into the story of optimism, I think there is a window of opportunity that we can tap on. Taliban will have no other reason to fight anymore, per se, formally, to say that the US presence or the international community is in Afghanistan in terms of the foot soldiers in the ground, because it's going to be the Afghan forces. So they're losing their quote unquote legitimate reason for the fight. There is also positive signs in the regions, as colleague mentioned earlier, for a prosperity and stability in Afghanistan. We can tap into that regional partners and regional politics in a very odd way. I think there is a decline for extremist thoughts in the Gulf region. So I think we can tap on that, which didn't exist 20 years ago, and it's existing today. And there is a very strong and positive engagement of the UN, as they can take the lead to maneuver or to take the lead on the negotiation. So I think if we sum it up, it really comes to two parts: continuation of the talks, that we have to continue to lead that with the UN as in the forefront, and bringing the region and the important players. And I think still Pakistan is one of the most important players that they must deliver in the type of influence they have on Taliban. That's one. And then I think far most important is the support to our ENDSF, because they will continue to have to fight. So I think we really have to look into the bright side of the story as well. But if it is not managed, and if it isn't managed, I think we still have not overcome the risk that is associated with dropping or abandoning, quote unquote, the type of achievement we have made in Afghanistan in the last 20 years.
Thank you, Ambassador.
These could be lost easily.
Very, very helpful. Let me read a couple of questions, and I'm going to let the panelists pick and choose. So, Ewan Grant from London, former law enforcement analyst with UK Customs Service. Can Pakistan moderate the demands of the Taliban? It's a little bit to the comments that Ambassador Raz was just making. So Ambassador Olson, I'm looking at you when I asked that question. Jim Wang from the Treasury, are there any initiative plans or actions to replace the gap that was left by the international community, support for Afghanistan's government that will ensure independence from international aid? That's an interesting question. Maybe Ambassador Wayne or Annie Forsheimer. There's a question here from my friend Jeff Grieco from the Afghan American Chamber of Commerce. Senator Inhofe recommended last week in an op-ed to keep 1,000 troop capacity on the ground for counterterrorism and embassy security. The Biden administration recommended a 600 Marine contingent at Embassy Kabul for protection. The Taliban this week stated no troops will be allowed under their agreement with the US. NATO said they would secure Kabul airport, but Turkish involvement was not mentioned. It seems like everyone in the administration is waiting for the situation to turn chaotic before they agree to rethink this decision. It seems we need leadership on this as soon as possible. Where will that leadership come from? And then here's another question from Sana Vaidya from the CSIS Humanitarian Agenda. What do you think the future of the US-Taliban relationship is? So let me start with Rick Olson on this question about the Pakistan and the Taliban, and then anybody can take any of the other questions. But let me start with you, Ambassador Olson, on this question of Pakistan, Taliban.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Look, I'm gonna say that I'm probably gonna not make myself terribly popular with this response, but I think that Pakistan obviously has a history with the Taliban. I mean, they have in effect countenanced a safe haven in their territory for the better part of 2 decades, from which the Taliban was able to retreat during the non-fighting season, and the leadership resided in Pakistan. But all that said, I don't think that they have had a direct command and control relationship over the Taliban, as some in Afghanistan believe. I think the Taliban have been notoriously stubborn and difficult, and pursued their own agendas. And so I think Pakistan has the ability to influence the Taliban in certain ways. I don't think it has the ability to actually direct the Taliban to do things, especially, again, in ways that the Taliban doesn't perceive it to be in its interests. So it has used its influence actually to get the Taliban to come to the table. A concrete example is in the Doha negotiations was releasing Mullah Baradar, who'd been detained at the request of the US, I believe, and was released and has now headed the negotiations. He's been the counterpart to Ambassador Khalilzad. I think it's also, and again, this is not a fact that everyone will entirely welcome, but I think the fact that the Taliban has not attacked US forces as they're withdrawing is perhaps attributable to a certain amount of Pakistani influence. But I don't think that that Pakistan actually has the ability to force the Taliban to reach political settlement. I think that they could use their influence perhaps more than they have to get the Taliban to engage seriously, and I think that should be done. But I also think it's important to do it on a regional basis, because the Taliban has shown a propensity to go and look for other sources of support. It has a nascent relationship, in particular with Iran. And so if Pakistan is pushed too hard on these issues, it is entirely, and they do crack down on the Taliban, it's entirely possible the Taliban will go shopping for another patron. So I think it really should be done on a regional basis. Over.
Thank you. Annie, let me add one other question. And I've said to you many times, you've been a moral beacon to me on the issue of Afghanistan. When I had a conversation with you, I was so moved. I got on a plane and went because of the conversation I had with you. You know this. So I want you to answer this question from Lee Thomas Pasquarella, retired. What is our ongoing purpose in Afghanistan? So that's for you. You don't have to answer this now, but I know you'll have a thoughtful moral answer to that question. But let me give you the floor on anything else that I put before. And then if you want to think about that question, I would like to hear from you about that.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your kind words. You have a moral compass that nobody needs to adjust or rev up. It's right there. I want to look at that question from Jeff Grieco that, we hear about certain numbers of troops guarding the embassy, or the Turks will or will not be at the airport. And it, in his way, he points out an apparent lack of leadership on this. And I concur. It's a set of tactics looking for a strategy. If we knew what we wanted, we would know how to get it. And I think that we should be better at articulating what we want, which really, in a way, speaks to that question. What we want is a stable and sustainable peace settlement, right? I mean, that's in our national interest. It also happens to be in our moral interests. And I think that we should be doing what it takes to get there. And when it comes to the Taliban having a veto power over whether or not Afghanistan can have a functioning international airport, I think that we should be looking at our bilateral security agreement and our relationship with the legitimate government of Afghanistan as being more important and more worth protecting than our stated desire to have the Taliban on our better side. And I'll echo Representative Waltz. It's time to be blunt. And so, if what we want is a stable, negotiated peace, a Taliban takeover is not going to get us that. It will get us resistance and self-defense groups and a return to an all against all chaos, and that literally is wrong and also not in our interests. So I think we work from articulating our national interest and work backwards from there about the modalities of how to achieve it. And I certainly would think that guarding the airport and guarding the embassy are among those modalities.
Ambassador Wayne.
So let me take up a little bit the question on economic assistance and support. One of the things that I think is essential that we have in the near future is actually a gathering of donors, maybe hosted by the World Bank, to talk through how everybody's going to continue getting their support to Kabul. The government's functioning is dependent on international support. And to answer the question, the World Bank was saying that that support would be needed up through 2030, long before we got to this situation, before COVID-19 struck, and before we are at the point of US troop withdrawal. So there's no question that Afghanistan, whoever is running Afghanistan, is going to need international support. And in fact, donors have been trying to message the Taliban for a while, saying, you know, we'd be happy to keep helping, but you got to work with us here. You have to respect basic human rights and negotiate a representative solution, representative government coming out of this in a sustainable peace. It's not clear how much that message has been heard. I think probably some Taliban have heard it, but not as many as probably need to, and probably not a lot of the commanders out in the field who think they're on the verge of victory right now after many years of struggle. So I think it's very important that international donors remain together, that they come and present a longer term vision at looking out several years of the assistance they're willing to provide, to both not just to keep the government going, but to get to a position where you can continue development and also where you can meet the humanitarian needs of Afghans. I mean, those humanitarian needs, which were pretty great otherwise, have increased significantly during COVID-19. And in a number of the scenarios going forward, you could see certain parts of the country with much higher humanitarian needs. So there needs to be this coordination. I know the chief of the UN Human Refugee Agency noted the other day that they are doing contingency planning, looking ahead as they should as to what kind of things could happen in parts of Afghanistan that they would need to respond to with other donors. So there's the development assistance, there's the keeping the government functioning, and there's this humanitarian need that's out there and could grow larger in the months ahead. So there is a lot to do on this whole economic side of the ledger.
I want to get each of you to get one more bite of the apple. I got two other questions I want to just put in the mix here. One is from Seema from USAID. One of the panelists mentioned that we have not thought through the details of the exit decision. It seems that lack of detailed planning when entering or exiting a war, Iraq, Afghanistan, for example, is identified as a recurring problem. With all the human and financial resources and the skills and talent available to the United States, why does this lack of detailed planning continue to happen? Really good question. Second question is from Hayden from the US Army. We cannot stay in Afghanistan forever. If now is not the time for withdrawal, then what would be the conditions needed to be in order to justify fully leaving the country? So you all had some other questions. I'm going to put these to you. Let me turn to Ambassador Olson. There was a question earlier about Turkey. Maybe you might just reflect on that, or any of the questions, anything else you wanted to mention, Ambassador Olson. You're on mute, Ambassador Olson.
Yeah, sorry. I don't have the question on Turkey in front of me, but you know, on this question of not thinking through our exit, you know, I as someone who spent a lot of time in the U.S. government, 3 decades, you know, I would say the challenge here is that absent political guidance, it's actually very hard to do extensive planning. And in this particular case, given the circumstances in which the decision was made in a new administration, one of the first decisions that was teed up, and with, you know, frankly, the perennial concern within the U.S. government for leaks, because, you know, unfortunately, you know, I was talking before about plan A's and plan B's. And if you start doing a plan B, Unfortunately, in our government, it leaks, and it very quickly becomes the plan A. And so I think that there was a very, strong desire on the part of this administration, understandably, not to have the president's decision leaked by means of, potential planning for Plan B. That's probably not a satisfying answer, but I think that's the reality.
Okay. Annie.
On planning, I have the same experiences as my colleagues. There are a lot of good exercises out there, but the fundamental, as I was saying before, is you need to know what you want. And as far as the question of how long should we be there, the United States engages in countries all over the world where we have interests. And we don't always look at the clock or the calendar when we do it. The Cold War took a while. Some things that we've worked on have taken years or decades. And I don't think that that's the wisest way to go about our planning. We should be looking at whether or not we have interests that are at stake and whether our presence can still serve those interests. And the day that that ceases to be the case, then we should leave. But I think that there were ways of doing this that would have kept a very minimal number of US troops under more of a NATO umbrella, for example, that would have served our interests far better than what we're seeing right now.
So just
Pastor Wayne.
Just to jump on that, adding another decade to Rick's decades of experience, I've seen this happen repeatedly in the US government for the reasons that Rick put forward. It happened with Iraq when we were going into Iraq, and it happened when we left Iraq also. It is hard to get agreement on a sustained program of reducing your involvement and getting out of that involvement over time. We had a couple of moments in Afghanistan where we've done that. But irrespective of that, what's important right now is that we try and do the best we can in the situation in which we now find ourselves. And that's why a number of us have been arguing for organizing NATO, organizing the donors, organizing diplomacy, and really giving it a high priority to focus on making the best we can for going forward. And that's what's really needed right now. And that's what the Afghans need right now. They need to know the international community still cares about them and still cares about a sustainable peace, even if that's going to be really hard to achieve. So I think that's where we should all be focusing our efforts.
Each get 45 seconds. I'm going to start with Ambassador Olson. Parting thought. Ambassador Olson, Annie, Ambassador Wayne. Ambassador Olson.
Yeah, well, I think the important thing for us to do right now is to pivot, to supporting the government, to doing everything we can to make sure that the Republic it gets through what is going to be a very difficult and challenging period. And I think the most important thing I would say is, we're disengaging militarily. That should not signal a general disengagement from Afghanistan or from the region. We did that before. We did that after the end of the Soviet occupation in 1989. And look what it got us. Direct line from our decisions there to 9/11. So we have decided we're going to shift to diplomacy and development, but we need to be serious about it. Over.
Annie.
I just completely concur with what my colleagues have said, that especially as Ambassador Wayne puts it, it is time now to step up our efforts in all of those areas that make a difference with respect to a negotiated settlement. And obviously, as we've all said, that includes maintaining our fulsome support, meaningful support to these Afghan security forces as they fight their fight.
And just to build on that, I agree with everything my colleagues have said. But just to note that, so this is really an important test for US diplomacy and using non-military tools to still get defendable, satisfactory, good outcomes. It's not going to be smooth and it's not going to be easy, but we have to remain engaged to pass this test. And I hope we can. It's going to be very important for Afghanistan, for the region, and for the credibility of the United States and its partners in this process.
I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Ambassador Raz. I want to thank my friends and colleagues who are panelists on this in this conversation. Thank you all for joining today, and watch this space. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you.